George Kilpatrick Inspiration for the Nation, celebrating people we feel good about. We are so pleased to be joined by Professor Paula Johnson, Director of the Cold Case Justice Initiative and a professor at the College of Law at Syracuse University. Our go-to person, quite frankly, for the unwelcome news from the United States Supreme Court this week that race-based considerations at two universities, Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, could no longer be considered as part of the admissions process. And Justice Roberts saying that we have never permitted admissions programs to work in that way, and we will not do so today. He said that this cannot be reconciled with the guarantees of the Equal Protection Clause. He also said both programs lack sufficiently focused and measurable objectives, warranting the use of race, unavoidably employing race in a negative manner, involving racial stereotyping, and lack meaningful endpoints. And of course, the dissent was swift and brutal, especially by the two liberal justices, or three of the two liberal justices. Justice Sotomayor said that this rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress, while Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson says that it would be deeply unfortunate if the Equal Protection Clause actually demanded the perverse, historical, and counterproductive outcome that Justice Roberts talks about. Anyway, I'm just trying to glean quickly from some of the excerpts, courtesy of the New York Times. Professor Johnson, let's start with what you have been marinating with all day around this decision.
Well, that's a good way to put it. Because since this opinion came out, I think I saw it about 10:30 this morning. And since that time, I have been trying to wrap my mind around what it actually says, and then what are its implications. And there are several things that occurred to me. One, I think the opinion, the majority opinion was written by Chief Justice Roberts. And we know from previous opinions by Chief Justice Roberts having to do with race, where he looks at educational programs. There was a busing case some years ago, case dealing in Seattle, Washington, dealing with secondary school admissions issues. We've seen him in voting rights issues, the Voting Rights Act in particular. For instance, he has just expressed antipathy for the use of race in deciding legal cases, even where it is clear, and I would argue that in this instance as well, where it is clear that race remains a salient factor as to who gets the benefits and who gets the burdens in American society and all of its institutions. And he simply seems to have this myopic view that we cannot include race in the consideration, even as the reality is that race continues to work discriminatory impact and intents, I might add, in all of these areas in American society. He just seems to have a different and unrealistic and not reality-based perspective about what race means in this society. And so he decides cases in accordance with a view. And I think the reference to two of the dissenting opinions by Justice Sotomayor, by Justice Jackson, speak to this, because essentially what they are saying is that wishing doesn't make it so. Wishing that all things were equal in American society and who gets opportunity and who does not doesn't make it so. Things are not equal. And so to make some inroads into that, it is important to consider race. And that, interestingly enough, it seems to me, there is the matter of precedent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Chief Justice Roberts has been someone who has argued in other instances how important it is to maintain the court's institutional values, and precedent, and following precedents is one of them. Now, as it relates to this area, and just to finish that thought, in Dobbs, for instance, in the abortion rights case, it was Roberts who wanted his colleagues on the conservative side of the court to only decide the case that was before them,
Mm-hmm.
and to not make a sweeping ruling that did away with abortion rights in the United States in the Dobbs decision. It was his position that they only needed to decide the Mississippi-based case and not go any further than that. And that's judicial restraint, right? That's an argument for judicial restraint. In this case, however, he did exactly what he had said that his colleagues, namely Justice Alito, writing for the majority in Dobbs, did in that case, in which case he said here in the Harvard and the University of North Carolina cases that race could not be used in a very sweeping opinion. And that need not have been the case in deciding what was before them. So that's the other thing. He did not adhere to precedent, and he misrepresented the situation as to how race is being used in admissions decisions, right? For years now, race has been used as part of a holistic
Right.
consideration. It has not been something that in the most explicit way has been dispositive of admissions decisions. It's part of a number of things that are considered by admissions departments. So that representation of the way in which race is determinative is simply not the case in the ways in which colleges, universities, and other higher education institutions make these decisions. Another aspect of this case that has been occurring to me, and maybe it's the most, in some ways, is the most disturbing aspect to me, comes especially in Justice Sotomayor's dissenting opinion, where she says it is okay legally, right? Our opinions say it is okay to consider race when we are talking about the criminal justice system. And so issues of who gets stopped, who gets frisked, who gets incarcerated, race can legitimately be used in those considerations, but not for the purposes of who gets opportunities for education. And let me add this to that point. Chief Justice Roberts said, even though it wasn't raised, there is nothing in this opinion that precludes the use of race as it relates to the military.
Yeah.
Because, yes, curious.
That was a footnote. People missed that.
Well,
yeah.
I didn't miss it. And I find that, and a lot more attention needs to be brought to it. Because here's the question. He said that our national interests can rely on having a diverse military. Now, don't we have to ask, how can it be so in the military and not be so in educational institutions? And what it leads me to think is that in the most cynical way, what the court is saying, it is okay for race to be used when we are talking about the disproportionate impact and population of people of color in incarcerated facilities. And it is okay for race to be considered if people of color are to be in positions where they can lose their lives in the military to protect the interests of this country on foreign soil and in the United States. But it is not okay for race to be considered for people of color, Black and brown people especially, to have the opportunity for higher education in these United States. There is something very, 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 very wrong with that.
Professor Johnson, Paula Johnson, who is the professor of law at Syracuse University, I'm thinking now about how we got here, right? So how we got here because this conservative group sued Harvard and University of North Carolina. And in the Harvard case, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson recused herself. So her opinion was only in the North Carolina decision for the record. And they were suing because, and this is how I understand it, they sued Harvard because they were alleging that Harvard's admission policy that made it more, that improved the likelihood that Latinos and Black and brown folks would get in was discriminatory towards Asians. Is that right? Is that what I understood?
That is correct. That is correct. Yes.
Right. And so they sued on that basis. And so so interestingly, I guess, Professor Johnson, looking at this and this decision, certainly, you put this in the context of some of the, like you said, Roe, with the dismantling of Roe, and Clarence Thomas writing with the majority, obviously, who, when he was selected, right, to replace, and
Justice
I don't even want to say replace. It's almost blasphemous to say that, right?
Yeah, sure.
But when Justice Thurgood Marshall was when to take the spot, if you will. I guess that's the best way to put it.
He filled the seat. He filled the seat that had previously been held by Justice Thurgood Marshall.
That's the best way to put it. He was the
person who was nominated to fill that seat once it became vacant. Yeah.
And so there's some larger issues at play for me. I mean, you look at what's happening in Florida. You look at what's, I was just recently on a call, Professor Johnson, where we were talking about gender-based violence, and the program basically, talking about men having mostly been the perpetrators of this. Well, I was just told that they cannot go into the schools, that teaching about that is a violation of the new Florida law, because it would have the impact of making, quote, men feel bad, or you can't teach anything that'll make somebody feel bad or whatever. So this goes along with some of the other movements around this country. And I guess Professor Johnson, uh, to come back to affirmative action, but any of these programs that were progressing, Mike Pence said something that I thought was that really suggested a mindset. He said something to the effect, "I'm glad we're rolling this back to a time in America when we were judged on the content of our character." And I was like, "Well, when was that time? When was that time when African Americans in particular, because were ever fully realized in their full citizenship in this country? When was that time? It ain't today, and it wasn't yesterday. So when was that time?" And so I'm just trying to figure out now, Professor Johnson, given this, what will this mean for institutions? What will it mean for Syracuse University College of Law? What will it mean for,
So it will mean something for all of us, and in particular ways. It will mean something for the institutions, and it will mean something for the broader society. So let me talk about the institutions for a moment first. You know, Justice Sotomayor is she just has a way of getting to the nub of things, and I just appreciate her writing and her her analysis, her candor, and just cutting to the chase. And sometimes she will use an expression. And so in this instance where she talks about the fact that she says in her dissent, ignoring race will not equalize a society that is racially unequal. And she talks about the fact that, again, nearing the end of Chief Justice Roberts' opinion, where he says, nothing in this opinion should be construed as saying that you cannot, in your individual application, talk about your own background, your racial background, and the ways in which race have been, important or influential, or have, maybe worked some kind of discrimination on you. You can put that in there. Justice Sotomayor says that is trying to, what the Chief Justice has done in that instance, has tried to salvage what he knows to be, in the main, a decision that has undermined successful efforts, effective efforts to create greater opportunity for people from racial and ethnic backgrounds to enter into colleges and universities and other institutions. And she says it is putting lipstick on a pig. And I thought about that, and when I read that, it occurred to me, I've heard that expression before. But when she used it in that instance, I understood it precisely, right? Because the rest of the opinion is all about how we can't use race, and race is not important, and, everything is equal. We're all equal. And, he has said previously in opinions, the best way not to discriminate on the basis of race is not to discriminate on the basis of race. That was in the Seattle School District.
This is Roberts writing.
Right. And so then you throw this, little, line in there about, but you can tell your own story. There's nothing in here that says you can't, in your application, say something about yourself and race, right? And how it's relevant. But here's the thing. This is exactly how it's been done. Right? This is what people have said in their applications. This is who I am. This is what it means to me to be able to go to college or university or law school or med school or wherever they're going, right? And it's relevant for you to consider my application based on all of who I am.
Yeah.
And the colleges looked at that and said, that's relevant to us too, because we want to have an entering class that has the diversity of people from the nation. You've got international students. So the admissions departments, right, have tried to arrive at classes that reflect the diversity throughout the country, indeed beyond the country.
Right.
And so it's a throwaway line in some ways, although it might be the sort of thing that's picked up on and gains greater currency because it is a part of the opinion, right? So the institutions, just to be even more specific about your question, so what the institutions will do now is read this opinion very, very carefully. We all are, right?
Right.
Figure out
And as
exactly
you
what
answer
it
that, and as you answer that and consider that, the bottom line is, will this mean that Black and brown folks will have less access to, I guess, predominantly white institutions of higher education? Because that's now what's being kind of played with. Oh, will this then mean that more opportunities for HBCUs, for example? So in your context, does it mean that there will be less access for Black and brown folks?
So what I predict that it means is that, these cases were brought now, think about this. You're talking about elite schools, the so-called elite schools,
Right.
right? Because, in so many, places and positions of, authority and discretion and policy making, a lot of those folks come from the elite schools. I mean, look at the Supreme Court itself,
Right.
right? Two schools where most of the people have come from, and that's over like centuries, right? Harvard, Yale, Harvard, Yale. Does anybody really believe, that Harvard and Yale, have a monopoly on wisdom and intelligence and, analysis? I mean, it can't be. It just can't be. So, so it's going to have a particular impact, I presume, on those institutions that are considered the quote unquote elite institutions. But as to the others, where the majority of students will attend in any event, I don't think it will have the same impact. But even having said that, it does mean that admissions departments across the board are going to want to examine their policies to make sure that they are investigating ways in which race alone is not going to be the basis of their admissions decisions. And so it means that they will have greater responsibility to do things like making sure that there is outreach to communities where they may not have done that before, right? Going into communities where there is a higher proportion of students of color and letting them know, let those students, prospective applicants know to apply to their schools. They've got to go to those students and to schools in all of the neighborhoods to make sure that those students also see themselves as valued to come in and be considered for, applying. So they've got to do all of those things. They've got to do more pipeline programs. They can do all of those things and be even more creative, but also more intentional about making sure that there are many ways to accomplish this than what they have been doing previously. So they've got to redouble their efforts at examining what those things are.
Professor Johnson, how much do you think that this is the narrative, right? Because when you explained, how affirmative action was used, you said that race was a consideration amongst other factors, but it seems as though what the majority is saying and what this conservative leaning folks are saying is that race was the only thing, like that was the only consideration, and that nothing else mattered. President Obama, Michelle Obama both weighed in. Michelle Obama talking about her own insecurities around being on a campus that was predominantly white and wondering if it was because of affirmative action. And then when she got her footing, she realized that she belonged because she did the work and all this kind of thing. So how so the point is it was never just about that. And I guess going forward, I guess I started this question in narrative, right? Are we just failing at communicating the story, or is it, or what's the remedy, and how do we reshape the narrative in this political climate that we seem to be losing case after case after case of things that were guarantees and protections for us?
Well, yeah, there is certainly, backlash and backsliding on issues that, and policies that were making it possible to advance within the society for all people, right?
Yeah.
People who had previously not been included or considered, that they were now having opportunities to, to advance, and not just being seen as, having the burdens of being in the society,
right?
But also having some of the opportunities of being in the society. So that is, absolutely a trajectory that, that is happening now. We're seeing this, tomorrow the court is going to issue a case on LGBTQ plus rights. Anxiously awaiting what they're going to say about that, because, they can, roll back some anti-discrimination, policies with respect to LGBTQ rights, and so, we've got to be, very concerned about these things. But here is the thing, some of the, surveys that people have taken in the United States suggest that folks are of two minds about this, and contradictory in what they say, because a majority of Americans across backgrounds say that diversity in education, higher education, is important.
Right.
But then when you start to break down by, race, ethnicity, you find that more people of color find that, race should be considered, and fewer whites say that it should be considered. And so the question is, you think it's important, but the things that have been effective in getting us there are things that you don't want to see occur. Right. So there's a contradiction there, because these things have been, more, effective than other things that have been tried before. And so now we've got to go, again, and see, well, what else can work. But here's the other thing, George, and this is why I say there's the institutional aspect of this, but then there's also the broader societal aspect of it, right? Because it's not just about diversity. It's not just about bean counting. How many of this type of person is in the class, and how many of this type of person is in the class? It is also about histories and legacies of discrimination, and inequality. And this proportionality in so many ways.
And as you're answering, and I know you're short on time, I wanted to inject what the argument is. All of that being considered, why don't we just make it based on socioeconomic, which by default will pick up some of that? Can you fold that into your answer?
Well, it is a part of the response, but it is not the entire response. This is because we have to understand that many schools in predominantly, people of, communities of people of color are under-resourced, right? We know that this is the case. And so that's why, as a broad matter, we have to invest the necessary resources in the schools in all of our communities. That's not happening, right? Because the way in which things are set up, the more affluent areas get the better schools. Now, if we really thought that everybody within, say, a state or a commonwealth should benefit in our educational institutions, we wouldn't have formulas that allowed fewer resources depending on where your zip code was. So that's only part of the answer.
Yeah.
The other fact is that no matter where you are, right, in different, professions, settings, we know that there is still bias against people.
Black people.
Black people, brown people. We know that there is still bias, in terms of who gets hired, who gets promoted, who even gets considered for positions. So beyond the fact of the economic inequalities, once people are in positions, we know that there is still discrimination against them. So it happens, across the board and irrespective of economics. But we certainly have to include that in part of the the ways in which we can, respond, to what the court has just decided.
Professor Paula Johnson is the director of the Cold Case Justice Initiative and also a professor of law at Syracuse University, specializing in these issues. Professor Johnson, I think that, NAACP has released, every organization has released their statement. And we know that that just means on this election cycle, when we think about the power of voting in these local elections, right?
Yes.
I mean, and I know you got to go, so I'm just going to say that. And if you got something to say, go ahead. But
yeah, and see, we've been here before, but I never tire of saying this because it is so critical. And so there are two things before I go that I want to emphasize. One is on this point about voting. This simply continues to highlight why it is so essential, so critical for people to vote. Who is in office? Who makes the decisions about things like Supreme Court nominations, right? That is a function of the U.S. Senate. If you don't vote for people to be the senators in your state, right, who will more likely vote for someone like a Ketanji Brown Jackson than a Clarence Thomas, right, then that is why we can have a court that is as lopsided as the one that we have now at 6-3, right? Because who's on those congressional committees, like the Judiciary Committee?
Which is why, Professor Johnson, that is why Donald Trump is in polling high, even though he's basically a criminal. I said it, right?
Yeah. Well, yes, and I don't disagree. So it's important to vote on every level. On the local level, who's on your school board? Who's in your common council? Who's in your state assembly? These are the folks who are making these decisions, because now we see they are affecting our very lives, right? And so you've got to vote. Yesterday was an election day. And I don't even want to guess how many people did or did not
Well,
vote for elections yesterday,
the
for
turnout was
school
a
board
bit,
members and that, so right?
a bit. I mean, you see, there were some places where only 300 people showed up in some places. Okay.
Yes. So just to emphasize the point, George, vote, 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 right? So that you have people there who are representing your point of view, who can make the decisions in a representative democracy about things that matter to you. There's absolutely no reason why this court should have 6 people who are vowed to be conservatives on it, and 3 members who are on the liberal side of things. There's absolutely no reason for that to be the case, and they will be there for some years to come.
Yeah. You have one
The
more
other
point?
point I want to make is that let's don't make any mistake about it. There is always resistance. There is always resistance to restrictions, to measures that would seem to limit our rights, our protections, our ability to live and to thrive. There is always resistance, and I suspect and expect nothing less in these circumstances. We will find our way out of this morass because we are a resilient people. We are thoughtful. We are brilliant. We are creative, and we will not give up. And that is what you can expect to see in the days, months, and years to come.
And President Biden hinted at some sort of executive action that might be able to be taken. So we'll see what happens.
We have to use all the tools in the toolbox, and we cannot give up. We have faced setbacks before. This is too important for us to be complacent about it. Yeah, I have been chagrined this entire day since that opinion came out, but I thought about it again, and I know that we are a smart and resilient people, and this too will be something that we will meet with the challenge that it deserves, and we will persevere and we will survive.
Professor Paula Johnson, professor of law at Syracuse University, director of the Cold Case Justice Initiative, informing us that the work ain't dead yet. We will resist, we will fight, and we will win in the long run because justice will prevail. George Kilpatrick, Inspiration for the Nation, Professor Paula Johnson. Thank you so much.
Thank you.